thank you very much for being here today for this periodic seminar. I don't know if I should call it a classical periodic seminar or a distinguished seminar. Anyway, I have to say that it's quite emotional for me to introduce Borislav today for many reasons. For many reasons on the professional side, because we have been collaborating a lot. And on the personal side, because he's a good friend of mine. Borislav spent the past 6 years of his life in the lab. He did his PhD here, and now he's a postdoc, as all of us. And I have to mention that today he's talking about unbreaking flexibility of wormhole-switched priority-preemptive network on chips. Borislav will have around 30 minutes to talk on this subject, and just have fun.
Yes. Patrick, thanks for kind words and for introduction, and guys, thanks for coming. Today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the state of the art in the real-time analysis of wormhole-switched priority-preemptive NoCs, and with a slight focus on routing mechanism and routing flexibility. This title is actually the title of the paper published this year in RTCSA, co-authored with Miguel, whom I'm sure all of you know, and with Leandro, that majority of you already know. I think that almost all of you are roughly familiar with the context of my work, which is similar to the context of the lab direction in terms of research, so I'm going to jump through these initial things pretty quickly. First of all, I assume real-time systems, meaning we care a lot about timing and we want to extract timing properties. Hard real-time systems, in a sense, we don't want to have missed deadlines. Then we consider what's called multiprocessor platforms. Now we all know that evolution trends of computing devices in the last several decades have been manifested with a transition from unicores to multi and many cores. In some areas that went quite smoothly, in some others, like real-time systems, this is still an ongoing process, and multi and many cores are still considered as the next frontier technology, still to come. These are some of the example platforms that will be analyzed in this work. Now, many cores, compared to their ancestors, bring lots of benefits, such as design cost reduction, thermal energy savings, possibilities to implement new functionalities, extend existing ones, or they're more resilient to core failures. But there are lots of challenges related to their application into the real-time domain. I'm just going to briefly touch here on those that are relevant for the context of my work. Of course, you can come up with much more. Let's consider the uniprocessor, which has a set of functionalities deployed on it. And there is also a unique memory subsystem on this platform. Now, unicores inherently brings sequential execution, which means there is the absence of parallelism, and things are easier to analyze in that context, and the majority of the work has been done in the context of uniprocessor scheduling, with some extensions for resource accesses, resource management, and so on and so on. In the multi and many core domain, the problem comes from the fact that functionalities not only share the same processor, but they share the same system, and they may have different, more complex type of interference. For example, the communication between two processes requires an explicit exchange of messages across processors, resulting with interprocessor communication. Similar thing occurs when we want to perform migrations of the workload across different processors. We have to facilitate that with the interprocessor communication. And finally, if we have a unique memory subsystem, and if two of them from two different cores want concurrently to access the memory, there will be runtime arbitration, perhaps for accessing the memory subsystem. So far, many cores and multi-cores have been studied from the context of multiprocessor scheduling, in a sense of what happens on cores. But what happens on the interconnect mediums, for example, in core-to-memory and core-to-core communication, it has not been well studied and well addressed so far. And that's the main topic of this talk today. So the model that I'm tackling is communication-centric. It assumes traffic flows, where flows are graphically represented as arrows. Each flow has characteristics such as its size, its source core, its destination core, its inter-arrival, its deadline, and if we have runtime arbitration in place, they may have priorities based on which routers will arbitrate and grant accesses. You are all, I'm sure, familiar to the uniprocessor or multiprocessor schedulability analysis, so you can already see a lot of similarities between tasks in scheduling, and rightfully so. Moreover, this system the model assumes 2D mesh network on chip, illustrated here, which is one of the most popular topologies and interconnect mediums in nowadays available many core platforms. And this is the illustration of one traffic flow from this router to this router. Now, we also assume wormhole switching, which is the mechanism, a transfer mechanism across the NoC, where prior to sending, the message is first divided into small elements of fixed size called flits, and they are sequentially injected into the network and traverse in parallel to their destination. I will illustrate that in a few seconds. The benefits of this approach is that it brings better throughput and performance than the other technique. For example, like something called store and forward switching, where two communicating entities, when they exchange a message, the message needs to fully travel across all routers with its complete size, as illustrated here. You can already notice the negative sides of this approach, because each router must be able to store, must have the capacity to store the entire message. And these are kind of hard requirements. In contrary to that, in wormhole switching, we can transmit the message by dividing it into small elements and sending them, releasing them sequentially while they travel then in parallel. We will see that on the next slides, even better explained. Now, this wormhole switching, as opposed to store and forward switching, brings several benefits, primarily reduced hardware requirements in terms of buffers, less buffering is needed, and also it has better throughput and performance. Recently, in the context of his PhD, Hazen was doing some analysis and comparison, head-to-head comparison with store and forward and wormhole switching, and he also reached some conclusions that align with that, but he has empirical evidence of that wormhole switching is much more efficient. And if you are interested more about details on that topic, you can speak with Hazen later. So let's just see how the message goes with wormhole switching. First, the header fleet is injected into the NoC, into the initial router, and then as it progresses, the others are sequentially injected. Once there are several injected, they travel in parallel while the new ones are being injected, and so on until reaching the destination. The tail fleet then goes and the collapse process occurs until finally the full message is received at the destination. This model gives us the possibility to implement real-time concepts such as preemptions and to make the whole system more deterministic and amenable to the real-time analysis, which we want if we want to derive the real-time guarantees. But before we see how we perform preemptions, just to complete this discussion on the model, by stating the relevant aspects. What are the relevant aspects in this model that we can have? First of all, assuming a given workload, how do we map the computation tasks on cores around, and how do we distribute them? That is the first thing. Then, once we have that in place, how do we route the messages between communicating entities? For example, from this and this one. Will we use this one, or will we use any other type of path or different route? Then, having mappings and routing in place, how do we assign priorities to different traffic flows? And the last thing, when we have all of that in place, how do we perform the analysis, and how do we actually extract the worst case response time for traffic flows? So now let's see how do we implement preemptions. For that we use hardware features called virtual channels, as illustrated here. Now each virtual channel is just a small buffer inside the port, a given port of our router, and it allows to store the flits of the so-called preempted lower priority flows. So what happens if two flows try to concurrently traverse through the same router and want the same output port, for example, the lower priority one will be stored inside its virtual channels, while the higher priority one will be granted the permission to progress. And that is what we call preemption in this model. Further, what I assume in my work, that each flow has its own virtual channel, so it has dedicated resource. It can be freely preempted and exclusively stored without having any other flows taking that buffer from him. And all this allows to implement preemptions on the fleet with the fleet level granularity on the fleet level. So related work, this is not a new model. It actually exists for more than 2 decades. And it is deceptively simple in a sense that all the time during the last more than 2 decades, people were thinking, okay, we finally nailed it down, and we finally have the end-to-end delays, and we know how to perform the analysis. And it is one of the most revisited topics in that period. This is the table that I took from the latest publication of Indrusiak et al. And it just lists only few relevant analysis methods and improvements chronologically, how they were proposed, and how more severe and nasty problems in the analysis that can occur were identified, and how the previous analyses were rendered unsafe or optimistic. And we will cover that in a bit more detail later. So let's see first how can we perform the preemption among two traffic flows, and how do we see it as researchers that analyze, not necessarily how it happens in the network, but how we see it to describe it and to analyze it. First of all, let's assume that we have the blue flow being transmitted, and as fleets are injected into the network, its execution time happens here. Now, let's assume that at this moment we have higher priority green flow being released. What we want is when green is being transferred, it imposes preemption on the blue one. So blue one is stalled, green one progresses. This is what we do in the analysis. How do we describe it? Until green is fully received at the destination, where the blue one can continue to go until it completes its transfer. So what can we conclude for this example? First, all of you can see, well, it's not necessary to consider entire paths. What we should consider is only the interference domain between these two flows. It's irrelevant what happens here and what happens here, as well as what happens here. Well, that's one view. And another thing that we can conclude is that maximum interference that can be caused per single hit of a single packet, like this one, is roughly equal to its traversal time, minus this epsilon here or here, what happens? And I can tell you both of these conclusions, although they look very simple, are wrong. But that's not something that has been discovered instantly or is able to be seen instantly. It took a lot of time, lot of reasoning and understanding of the model itself to be well described and well identified. And we will see that. So, if we, let's just forget what I said, let's go with this notion further, that we can analyze the system as it is, which is perfect because it gives us the possibility to analyze the worst case traversal time with the uniprocessor schedulability analysis equation. Perfect, we have higher priority flows. For all of them, we count the number of occurrences and multiply with a single hit interference, sum everything up, that's my response time. And it's okay. Let's see it on a simple example of 3 flows, where the blue one is the highest priority, middle, and the lowest priority, with these characteristics. So we start with the highest priority one, blue one. It has highest priority, its execution time, actually transmission time is 3, so its response time is 3, it's schedulable. Second one, the green one, has the transmission time of 2, but suffers 1 interference from blue, so it's 5. Since it's below its deadline and period, it is schedulable, and also the deadline and period of this one is 10, so it cannot possibly come twice. So it's 5. And the similar conclusion we can reach here, it goes for 2, its preempting flow goes for 2, in total it's 4, meets the deadline, and also cannot cause the green one to come twice. So what we conclude from here is their response times are less than their deadlines, all of them are schedulable. But as I mentioned you before, that's not true, because if we simply plot these release patterns of flows, blue goes, blue and green are concurrently released, blue goes, then green goes, and at the moment that green starts going, the yellow is released, so yellow suffers interference from the green one. When it finally gets 1 cycle to be transmitted, it's again preempted with a new release of the green one, and therefore yellow misses its deadline. So how is it possible that it has not been captured by this analysis? Well, simply because when we do the analysis, we see that green can preempt yellow once. But here we see that during its period it appeared twice, which makes this equation being unsafe and optimistic. So what researchers understood at that time is that we need another factor to account, but for what? The account for the existence of the blue flow. Because although blue doesn't cause interference to yellow directly, it messes up the occurrence patterns of the green one, compacts them, and make it indeed appear twice in the period of the yellow one. Now the first question is, we are now deviating from the uniprocessor schedulability analysis and we are entering uncharted territories. We don't know how to do things. It is kind of similar to uniprocessor schedulability analysis, but we don't know how to progress further, and what, more importantly, what are the implications. So what is this jitter and how much do we need to account for the blue one? The initial approach was, okay, simultaneous releases. It works for unicores, it must work here. We assume simultaneous releases. But that was also being discovered wrong. And the first analysis that accurately accounts for this indirect interference states that the maximum delay, the safe delay, the safe push that the green one has that has to be assumed for the green one is equal to its response time minus its transmission time. We are safe with that. And that was revealed in 2008 by the York researchers, and this is known as Shih and Burns analysis. This analysis stood the test of time for 8 years, and it was considered to be the state of the art applying to this type of NoCs. Now, I'm going to show you similar example, but with inverted priorities, and each buffer can store 3 flits. We need a more detailed analysis now because more specific conditions to show that this analysis is unsafe. Because as the analysis grew more and more accurate, finding counterexamples to prove them unsafe became harder and harder. So let's assume that here we have active flows. We will list which flow goes. So first let's assume that blue is released and blue goes. Now, at some moment, green is released. Since they are released from the same core, green immediately preempts. So the green becomes active and green goes. Blue completes, but blue cannot release the new flits while green one goes and establishes the path to the destination. Now, let's assume that the yellow one is released and preempts the green one. What happens is that as the yellow goes, the green starts getting buffered inside its virtual channel. Let's assume that the depth of the buffer is 3. So yellow goes, green doesn't go, but green gets buffered. But more importantly, notice that even though green doesn't go, it still imposes interference from the blue one, which makes the previous extension of the schedulability analysis unsafe, because the assumption is if the higher priority is preempted and cannot go, I can go. But here we see that neither green nor blue actually are able to progress. So all these buffered flits cause interference. All these green flows cause interference to the blue flow. Now, let's assume that just a second. Yes, so we were here at this moment. Now, because green filled all its buffers and it cannot fill anything anymore, it cannot go, finally at this stage blue continues to go in parallel with the yellow one, which is what we were assuming with the analysis from the beginning. And then blue goes a bit until the yellow one starts finishing its transfer, which causes the green to continue. Green automatically preempts the blue one, and these flits that already caused interference to the blue one will cause interference once more. So what we conclude from this is that there are flits of the green flow that can cause interference to the blue flow multiple times, not just once, which means that total interference per hit can be greater than the transmission time. This was noticed by the Chinese researchers this year, several months ago, and this implied the limited applicability of the previous She-Burns analysis, which holds only in cases where there is no buffer depths and where each router has a single flit. Only then is the analysis of She and Burns safe. But they provided the analysis, which was also pessimistic and also not safe. That was discovered very recently, a few months ago, by Andrusiak et al. And there is the new analysis that Leandro Allen and I did, and we hope that we finally nailed it down, but I'm sure that everybody else before us thought the same. Yes?
Can I ask a question? So, are the routing happening in parallel? So the blue one is transmitting and the yellow one is also transmitting, so they can finish at the same time?
The blue and the yellow flow.
They can, yes, they can go. That's true, that's true. Yeah, so just to wrap up, this analysis, this lower one, that is still a tech report on arXiv that is soon going to transactions on computers, is the current state of the art, to the best of our knowledge, in the real-time analysis of NoCs with arbitrary buffer depths, and Sheehan-Burns analysis is still valid, but only for single buffer for buffers that store a single flit. Now, while we were writing that paper on routing flexibility, we didn't know these things happened very recently, so we were working on the analysis of Sheehan-Burns. Therefore, the results we have are applicable only to the routers where virtual channels have only a single flit. Now, all other investigated aspects, I covered just the analysis here. Other investigated aspects are arbitrary deadlines, because here we are assuming constraint deadlines. Then what if multiple flows share virtual channels? There is another nasty properties coming out of that. Then there is a work on reducing the hardware requirements of this model, and that's something that has been done here internally in the lab. There is a paper co-authored with Hazen, his supervisor, and Miguel, and Stefan, my former supervisor. Then there has been done some work on mapping, and we've also done that. That has been done with Patrick together in the context of my PhD. Then there have been works on priority assignment, as well as work on different arbitration policies. We have done that in the lab as well, in collaboration with my supervisor Stefan, and as well as people who have done analysis improvements. But all of these works here have been based on the assumption that paths follow the XY route. XY routing is popular because it's deadlock free, and because it's easy to implement, and the majority of hardware vendors use it in current hardware. But yes, we have also contributed to the analysis improvements. But the question that came is, can we try to change the routes to explore something different, the XY routing, and let's test it to see how efficient it really is. And that was the idea for this paper. So, taking the Sheehan-Burns analysis, we wanted to see how can we derive the paths of the flows assuming fixed mappings, and see how it compares against XY routing. First of all, we assume minimal paths. So having a source and a destination, this is one possible path, this is another, these are all candidate paths, minimal paths. The benefit of minimal paths is that they give constant latencies, because each of them traverses 4 hops. We can have its traversal time as the constant and use it in the analysis. Second thing, we have solution space reduction, because these routers that are unlikely to produce good routes are not considered at all. We focus just on the area of interest. The other benefit is path has been described as a set of bits, 1 bit per router, where, for example, 0 means horizontal, 1 means vertical progress. So this path we can describe with this set of bits. The other one with this, and the other one with this. Because we know if path is minimal, we know in which direction it goes, so we just need to distinguish between horizontal and vertical advancement. Paths can be stored in headers and used as the packet traverses to route it on the way. And that's already implemented in hardware. For example, Calray does this type of routing. In the paper, we prove that the maximum number of paths per flow is equal to the factorial of its total number of hops, in this case 4, divided by the product of the factorial of horizontal advancements multiplied by the factorial of the vertical advancements, which is 2 and 2. So 4 factorial over 4 is 6. And indeed, for this particular example, we can have 6 possible paths of the flow. We also proved in the paper that there are no deadlocks in this kind of arrangements with minimal paths and unique priorities, obviously. So, coming back to the analysis of Sheehan-Burns, when we analyze it for the sake of deriving paths, we realize that here, worst case response time does not only depend on the higher priority flows, but it also depends on the priority ordering of higher priority flows, manifested with these jitters. That's also something that's not very much present in the uniprocessor schedulability analysis. So we do not only need to know who are higher priority flows, but also what is the order among them, because swapping the order among them may lead to different results. So we concluded that using this analysis as a test for the paths and path derivation is not very convenient approach, because once if we use it, we are testing only a limited specific set of candidates with a specific priority ordering. That is, we are using it, but we are testing only one possible solution. What we want is the mechanism to efficiently test classes of candidates, to browse quickly over the solution space. So we introduced indicative traversal time, which is very similar to the response time, except that we don't have jitters and we don't have notion of higher priorities. We don't have notion of priorities at all. We just consider everything that is on our path for this metric. Now, the benefits of this metric is that it's easy to compute because it can be solved for each flow immediately. It does not need pre-computed terms from the others to come in some form of a recursion. We can go directly with the equation that we have for any flow immediately. It is generic, it is not priority dependent, so once we analyze, it applies for whatever priority ordering that we choose for these flows. And it gives a good indication of the amount of traffic that a flow will face on a given path. So our goal is first to find the path with the smallest indicative traversal time. Now let's assume that we have a flow with this source and this destination, and these are the competing flows already mapped on the NoC. So how will we find the path from this source to this destination for the blue flow? First, we convert this into the direct acyclic graph, considering only the routers of interest, not considering these ones. It looks like this. Then the weight of each edge is equal to the flows that traverse it. You can see that. So then we go and plot the path from the source to the destination. Now, the one problem of this approach is that, unfortunately, local minima may not always lead to global minima. For example, if we start exploring the paths from this node and we reach this one, we have two possible paths, this one and this one. On the lower one, it will face the interference from F2. On the upper one, it will face the interference from F1. So imagine that F1 imposes less interference, so we will say this path is better. Okay, so if we at this stage discard the lower path and say this path supersedes it, once we continue analyzing further and reach this node, we will have the interference of this path F1 plus F2. While if we have been going with the lower one, we would just have F2, which means, as I said, local minima may not always lead to global minima, so we need to keep all of the paths until reaching the destination in the loop. And unfortunately, we cannot apply Dijkstra's algorithm for finding the shortest path because it relies on the property that the node has a unique way of being reached, that is that local minima is always the global minima, which is in our case not true. So how do we derive the paths? Well, we construct a table. For example, here we have the same figure from the previous slide, and we add the first entry. We will solve it in steps. In the first step, we will put just the source router, rho 1, and we will put the traversal time of the flow. We know it because it is the function of the number of hops and the size. So it's constant. Let's see 10. In the second step, we develop the current node, which is the source node, with potentially reaching row 2 and row 5. Now, they face different interference, 20 and 50. For the third step, we will select the one from the previous one, which is the second one, with the smallest ITT, which is row 1, row 5. And we develop it further. So we have row 1, row 5, row 6, and row 1, row 5, row 9. These are our 3 candidates at this stage. This one stays 20, these 2 are 15, because we don't face any additional interference from them. Now we select one of them for developing, for example, this one. And we have row 1, row 5, row 6, row 7, and row 6, row 10. Now, that is, here we would face additional interference, here we would not. So, from this list, we would select this one, and you can see when we continue from here, we reach here, and we're in the destination, and we found the path with the minimum ITT being 15. That's the way to do it. So, how do we? How is the whole algorithm is being plotted after we have defined this? First, for each flow, we compute the total number of paths for each flow, which is, you remember that equation with factorials. So we then sort flows non-decreasingly and treat them in that order. Why? Because the reasoning is, let's first give the paths to the flows which don't have that much flexibility. For example, flows that go only on x-axis or only on y-axis, they don't have the freedom to choose between multiple minimal paths. They have a single minimal path. So let's first map them route them on the platform, and then let the others come later, those that have more flexibility to choose. And those that have the most flexibility can choose the route in the end. For each one of them, we will find and assign the minimum path with the minimum ITT, as described on the previous slide. And after all paths are derived for all flows, then we apply some method for priority assignment. We have the analysis from York for doing that purpose, as well as there is recently work from Mellardal and from guys. Matthias, that was here on internship, is the second author in that work, I think. So once we have paths, we can apply some technique for assigning priorities. And we can finally, in the end, test for schedulability. If things are schedulable, fine, we succeed. If things are not schedulable, we go back and invoke path derivation again. But this time, instead of sequentially routing the packets, once the packet is being again routed, everything else will be already mapped on the network, so it will have more information how to efficiently choose the path, to realign its path potentially and reach a schedulable solution. And then we again assign priorities, and we can repeat that if it is not schedulable several times, perform several iterations until success, or if in 2 iterations we reach same paths and priorities, which means we simply can't schedule that. So in the evaluation, we compared our method for routing and priority assignment with not just x, y, and yx, but the best of x, y, yx. Here we plotted the number of flows in the flow set, 50, 100, 150, and 200. And here we measured the threshold where how much can we increase and decrease the message sizes such that the system is still schedulable with given routes. So you can see that if we give more iterations to realign paths and priorities, we can improve, and over the best of the x, y, yx, we can have the average improvement of more than 50%. And as the number of flows increases, the improvements decrease because there is a crowd on the network, and the benefits of providing routes that are thoughtfully derived routes slightly decreases, but the improvements anyway stay. In terms of virtual channels, the situation is very similar. We reduce the hardware requirements by increasing the iteration slightly, and also the number of needed virtual channels, the decrease is between 5 and 10%. In this experiment, we wanted to test how far is this approach from an optimal one. In a sense, we obtained the optimal priorities and the optimal routes by exhaustively enumerating all possible combinations on a small scale example, and we let our method, our heuristic method run. We compared with the best of x, y, y, x, and so on. And on the small scale example, we have been pretty positively surprised how well the method performs, that on average it is around 91% success of the optimal routes and priorities. Finally, we've observed the traffic distribution of the derived paths, and we can see that the traffic is well distributed. In a sense, the contention is brought to the areas of the NoC where it naturally belongs, the middle of the grid, while the corner routers still have acceptable amount of workload and almost never present bottlenecks. In contrary, the XY and YX routing mechanisms, in some cases, in many cases, unnecessarily cause bottlenecks here or in the corners because they are unable to route the packets differently and they have to follow special patterns. Finally, the computational complexity of the approach. Here we have plotted the number of possible flow paths for each flow, potential to be explored, and here is what is actually explored at runtime. So, when the number of possible paths is small, for example, if there is only one path, of course it has to be investigated, and then gradually in percentages decreasing as the number of paths increasing. What we are interested in most are these flows which have the maximum number of potential paths. And we can see for them that only the small amount of them is actually investigated at runtime, and for majority of them we find the minimal paths rather quickly. So it's not heavy, and it's comfortably executing for example 200 flows on a 10 times 10 grid or something. So to wrap the things up, we've noticed that dimensional ordered routing XYYX is not efficient, contrary to what people believe and what industry and academia tell. We found that ITT metric is very suitable for this class of problems. We've noticed that we've used minimal routes for search space reduction, and so far it looks justifiable, especially because we are on the 91% of optimal routes and priorities. The proposed method heavily outperforms dimension ordered conventional routing mechanisms. It finds near optimal solutions on a small scale example, and achieves good workload distribution, and is scalable. As future work, and something that kind of to trigger thinking is should we bother trying to extend the approach for non-minimal paths? In this case, for example, when we have the yellow flow, which is heavy in terms of utilization, of course, it would be beneficial, or maybe even the only viable approach, to circumvent it. But this is one artificial example, can we actually achieve these trends on a large scale when we have huge grids with a lot of flows, and will these small tweaks be beneficial or not? That's the question to be investigated. Can we push further towards obtaining optimal routes and priorities, and should we, given the results that we've seen? That's another question to be answered. and how to combine these approaches with mapping, because as you have noticed in the whole work, I have always had fixed source and destination and played around with these things. With this, I conclude my talk, and thank you for your attention.
A couple of questions. As it is always the case, when there is no question, I have to put one, right? Oh.
It's from because how do you assign the priorities or the virtual channels such that they are exclusive? How can you make sure two flows will not take the same virtual channel?
You can route. So once you have the routes and the priorities assigned, you have the quantitative analysis for each router. You can say, from this router, 5 flows go out. From this router, 3 flows go out, whatever. So the first analysis you have to do is what is the maximum contention for every port? Let's say 7. So then you will say, okay, in my platform, I must assure that each router has at least 7 virtual channels. Okay, when you achieve that, then you go into the following, the individual path of a flow, and you go. So in this router, I have the flow with the highest priority, so I'll take virtual channel number 1. In this one, when I go up, maybe I'm second priority, so I will switch to the second, and so on, depending on the traffic there. So they may switch virtual channels, but we make it to be in respect with the priorities of the other flows that traverse there.
But how did you prove no deadlocks in such kind of routing?
For minimal routing.
Yes.
So it's a two-stage thing. One thing is that given the minimal paths, you cannot have auto deadlock. You cannot deadlock itself. Because to deadlock yourself, you need to traverse some router or some link twice. If you're traversing it twice, you are not minimal. So this is the first thing, you cannot cause deadlock to yourself. The second part of the proof is, given the flows, assume that deadlock occurred. So in a set of flows that are involved in a deadlock, there is one with the highest priority. So who deadlocked him? Nobody it's for sure nobody involved in the deadlock, because everybody's smaller priority than him. So the only conclusion is he deadlocked himself. But the first part of the proof showed that there are no auto deadlocks. So you just show that in whichever situation you reach, there is a progress. There is a progress. Somebody is able to progress.
Yeah.
Things are not stalled.
Based on the priority assignment.
Based on the priority assignment. That's the key. If you don't have priorities, you can have, actually I don't know, I wouldn't comment on that, whether the deadlocks are possible for minimal routes without priorities. That I don't know, and I think it's not trivial to answer just like this. I haven't reasoned about that. I'm always working on the level of priorities.
Yeah, just by curiosity, do you think it will happen a lot when this many core platform will be really a bit more used? Do you think it will happen a lot that a cluster or a tile or whatever it is send a message to another? Because these cluster platforms, like, they have limited amount of memory. It's a working memory. It's like it's very small capacity, and I'm wondering in a practical scenario if it will actually happen a lot to have communication between two tiles, or whether one of these tiles will commit and save something in some off-chip memory, and then the others will read from there. It's a more like a design-related question. Like if I have, for example, here you have 16 cores. If I have 16 applications, will I actually do this application-to-application communication, or will I design my system so that they all commit their object to a shared memory? And I don't know.
Actually, very, very good question, very relevant question. Inter-processor communication, in my opinion, will always stay, but clearly not to the level of fat messages being transferred, but more on the level of small messages like interacts, because they need to sync, they need to exchange data, they need to do things, but these will be small messages for which, even by hardware, it will be guaranteed that they don't face that much interference and they can be easily transferred. This analysis applies more to, I would say, core to memory scenarios. Because, okay, here is, we put source and destination here, but it doesn't change that much the story if you put memory controller here and it's just going the same way up. So, yeah.
But how do you know, from regarding my first question, how do you know how many flows each core will generate beforehand? How can you get this picture in a real application scenario?
That is the assumption. I am.
So let's say a normal user, you run an application on a car array, for example. You have no clue what the flows.
It depends. Like if you put one executable which reads the data and send it periodically, but then you implement in your code in periodic, so you send periodic data. But like most of the communication, if your destination is the memory, then most of the communication will be basically reading instruction and data from the off-chip memory. So I don't think that can be modeled as a periodic flow. But then the core-to-core, the cluster-to-cluster communication here.
It has to be programmed.
Yeah, I think so.
This is an offline analysis.
Offline, yes. The things are.
I wanted to put one last question.
Yes.
So the analysis that you presented, again, is one way end-to-end something, right? As Vincent mentioned, we can have core to memory and memory to cores, because when you write something in memory, you have to you have to wait for the response of that. So you can have interference on your way to the memory and interference on the way back to the core. How would you see that picture? I mean, the analysis, assuming those two type of interference in that.
I would say that's something too ambitious, and we are actually starting to understand that even this simple thing as bounding the delay of message from one core to another is more complex than we thought, and we are struggling even to come up with the exact bounds on that. Coming up with something that is round trip, that involves different types of components, because you would have also something occurring inside memory controller, some kind of runtime arbitration, plus the message coming back and providing some meaningful bounds. It's very, very ambitious, in my opinion, at this stage. We still need to work on these small things, look them separately before and make it work efficiently before thinking how to combine them in a big end-to-end calculation.
Because it's kind of very similar to what what exists in the automotive domain, where you have many subsystems with one router at the middle, and you have a set of flows in the left network and another subset of flows that will have to interact. You have a way from subnetwork 1 to subnetwork 2, and also some other flows from subnetwork 2 to 1, and those you have to compute the interference in a round way. I don't know.
Yes, no. I am. Okay, so it's not that it is the optional way to go. It must be the way to go. That must be solved if we want these platforms in the real time period. It's not optional. It must be solved. What I'm just saying is that we are far away, at the current state to ask those questions when we don't have individual pieces solved together. I'm not competent to talk, for example, how do we analyze what happens inside memory controller and is it well understood there, but for the domain where I'm competent, I say, maybe you guys are ready, we are not ready yet. So, yeah.
And for the real-time domain, this is another question because I'm not sure. Do you think it's better to try to map your different application on the same board, and then you know that the problem is kind of intractable of browsing every path and then computing the worst case delay and the interference can be massive. So do you think it's better to go this way and really try to come up with the best set of paths and interference analysis, or is it better to look the other way and just partition the thing in space and in time and say, okay, I'm going to waste a few resources, but let's TDMA the whole thing. I have a time slot where this sync communicates with this destination and there will be no interference whatsoever. Definitely you waste resource, but given the complexity of the problem, and this is not going to be any better in the future, okay, because we have more cores and more even complex architectures. So do you think if you had to bet today, if it's worth it to look this way, like the way you are doing, or just say, okay, this is going nowhere, and better to look at how to partition things in time and space?
I don't have experience that much with how partition stuff works, especially these TDMA networks. What I've recently read is that things are not as straightforward there either. So it's not that this gives you a straight path forward, but pessimistic, and this is kind of an unpredictable way. No, there are issues there as well. So if I would, I don't know, I wouldn't dare comment on that, which one to rule out. But you mentioned something that is again an important issue here, which is I just tried here to derive the paths and assign priorities. And this is already too complex. If we add into this whole story empty board where we are supposed to map the workload, to do the schedulability analysis, the things called, to do the network routing, assign priorities, test the schedulability, it's also something that has not been done in this way end-to-end. So, how can I say, the whole end product of mapping, routing, priority assignment, and analysis. This also has not been done as a whole. We always assume 2 or 3 things are there, let's do the 4th one. But
even for simple problem, we already know that the research base is too big. If you want to
yes,
cover the whole thing.
Yes, even for a single one of them, the space is huge. And actually I don't know what is the way forward, to be honest. But the things are complex. Things are computationally complex to be solved, to be derived. But one good side is that we have now more and more computation capable platforms. So a lot of these problems that would be impossible to solve before can now be plugged into the cloud, and in a few hours or a day or 2, you have some meaningful result coming back. So it's a big question whether the computation will take over the complexity that we are bringing in or not.
So, thank you everybody.